Hey everyone, welcome back. This is the second lecture on stress. Our previous lecture looked at stress and illness and how stress impacts the body. This lecture is going to look at how do we cope with stress? What do we do about the stress that exists in our life? And so to get started, we first need to identify some factors that may increase our stress. And so the first two bullet points that I have there are actually review. Those are things that we've talked about already in this class. For example, we know that having an external locus of control can lead to experiencing more stress. And as a reminder, that is the idea that a person feels like they have very little impact over what happens to their life. And that can be a really stressful thing. If you believe it doesn't matter if you study hard or not, what happens on the exam is just going to happen, then that can be really stressful. It might not be as much work because you might just throw your hands up and say, forget it, I'm not going to study. But the reality is, it's stressful to feel like your actions have no consequence. Another thing that can contribute to stress are these different personality types. And so we talked about this as well. For some people, we call them a type A personality. And people with a type A personality are more prone to stress. They're more organized, they're more structured, but they have a hard time turning the brain off. And so, even if they don't have a lot of stuff they need to do, they're often stressed thinking about that list of things that they're supposed to be doing until they can mark everything off the list. And the reality is, once they mark everything off the list, they can usually find something else to spend their time doing. And so they're busy, they're motivated, but they're also vulnerable to stress. Now, something on this slide that's a little new that we haven't yet talked about are different types of conflict situations that can lead to stress, and I have four of them listed there for you. So the idea behind an approach conflict would be when you are put in a situation where you have to choose between two desirable things, but you can only choose one. And so you've got a free afternoon. I'm looking at this picture here. You can choose to either play tennis or racquetball, and you enjoy playing both tennis and racquetball. And so you're getting stressed. One friend wants you to go hit the tennis courts, another friend wants you to go hit the racquetball courts, and you're not sure which one you want to do. And that can be stressful. Go to the restaurant and you got to choose between getting pizza or spaghetti. Well, those are two delicious choices, and it's causing you some stress, right? These are what we call approach situations. They're stressful. The reality is they're usually not as stressful as some of these others because at the end of the day, hey, you're getting something that you probably want anyway. We compare that with avoidance. These are conflicts where you have to choose between two undesirable things, and that can be stressful. For example, am I going to choose this undesirable need to study for 3 or 4 hours on my test, or the undesirable fail the test? Well, both of those stink. You don't want to study a bunch of hours. You also don't want to fail. You kind of got to choose one or the other, and that can be stressful, right? Do you continue working in a degrading job, or do you quit your job and now you're unemployed? Two things that you don't want. Do you continue to live with painful backache, or do you pay for an expensive, scary surgery? These are the some examples of avoidance. Those two make sense. Approach, avoidance. Students don't usually struggle with those. Approach avoidance, sometimes students struggle because they make the mistake of saying, oh, it's the choice between something you like and something you don't like. Well, that's not stressful, right? If the choice is here, either choose a dessert that you find delicious or eating rocks, right? That's a silly example. Well, that's not stressful because that choice would be very easy. Approach avoidance is when you are trying to, you're put in a situation where your decision could have a positive outcome or a negative outcome, and you're not sure. That's the idea of approach avoidance. And so there's someone good looking in your class and you kind of want to ask them out on a date. Well, hey, if they say yes, that's awesome. But if they say no, that's embarrassing or that's upsetting. And so it's stressful to make that decision because the decision could result in something positive or could result in something negative. That's the idea of an approach avoidance. And then multiple approach avoidance. This is the most stressful of all. It's the most complicated. It usually takes the most time. The idea behind multiple approach avoidance is you are now trying to choose between things that both have possible positive and negative outcomes. And so, take college, for example. You're trying to figure out if you want to go to UMKC or you want to go to Ohio State, right? And so there's advantages and disadvantages to both. One might be closer to home, which has its advantages. You can, have your laundry done at home. You can maybe stay in the same zip code as your family and some of your friends. But there's also disadvantages there about being so close to home. And then you're thinking, going to this out of state school, maybe it's going to be really expensive, but it's in a cool city and you're looking forward to being in this cool place that you've never been before. So you get the idea. You're trying to weigh the pros and cons of multiple decisions or multiple factors, and that can be really stressful. So how do we cope with these different stressors? Well, there's two main types of coping. We have what's called problem-focused coping and we have emotion-focused coping. And frankly, it's pretty straightforward. Problem-focused coping is you are doing what you can to eliminate the source of the stress through direct action. So imagine for a moment you've got a really, really stressful exam coming up in school. Well, a problem-focused approach would to be study for the test, right? You are attacking the source head on, and that can help alleviate stress. If you're stressed about the test and then you say, okay, I'm going to sit down, buckle down, I'm going to study for a couple hours for this exam, that often helps alleviate the stress because you are going straight for the source. If you are arguing with a friend, problem focused coping would be go talk to the friend about the issue. Now we have positive and negative coping, right? So these would be things. Rarely in psychology does positive mean good and negative mean bad, but that's really what this means in this situation. Positive problem focused coping would be things like studying for the test. Negative problem focused coping would be things like trying to get a copy of the test so you can cheat, right? And then emotion focused coping is when you are not necessarily trying to address the source of the stress, the stressor itself, but instead you're just trying to address the impact of the stressor. So you've got a really, really tough test coming up, and you are going to cope with the stress of that exam by going to the movies with your friends or playing a video game or going for a run. None of those things actually eliminate the stressor, but they do make us feel better, right? And so emotion focused coping usually helps in kind of the immediate get rid of the impact of the stressor. The problem, as you can likely predict with emotion focused, is if you don't get rid of the stressor, that stress will often come back. So, exercising, hanging out with friends, participating in your hobbies, those are all great ways to deal with stress. Recognize that if you don't do anything to eliminate the stressor, it'll likely return. Some other things that we can do to help cope with stress is be aware of how our body reacts to stress, right? When we're stressed, our heart starts to speed up really quickly. We start to sweat, our breathing starts to become irregular. And then there are things we can do to try to calm the body back down, right? There are ways that we can sit in a chair. There are things we can think about. There are patterns to how we breathe to help calm the body down, right? And this sense of essentially meditation and breathing can help alleviate stress. In fact, they have tools now to help you become more aware of what your body is doing. We call this biofeedback, right? Biofeedback is when you are hooked up to a machine that gives you live feedback as to different physiological responses in your body. And so you can see in real time how fast your heart is beating. You can see in real time the patterns of your breathing. And what you can do is you can say, okay, well, if I sit this certain way or if I think about this certain thing, I see that my heart rate is starting to slow down. I'm starting to become more calm. And you can use that to your advantage the next time you're stressed out and say, okay, I know what I need to do to try to lower that autonomic nervous system, activate what we call the parasympathetic nervous system. Oh, I have on there also mindfulness, right? It's another meditation technique where you are becoming very aware of the present. The idea behind mindfulness is when we think about things that stress us out, it's usually either something that has occurred in the past and that is stressing us out, or something that's going to happen in the future and that's making us anxious, right? Well, the idea behind mindfulness is there's really nothing you can do about the past. It's happened. And we shouldn't be spending too much time worrying about things that have not yet occurred. The only thing that we can really control is right now, right? The present. And so mindfulness is the practice of becoming more aware of the present. And then finally, the last slide for today is a quick little slide on PTSD. And so, when we look at PTSD, it is an interesting disorder in the DSM because, unlike almost every other disorder in the DSM, when it comes to post traumatic stress, we've got a really good idea of what causes it. It's trauma, right? Now, following a traumatic event, for some people, certainly not for everyone, but for some people, they are going to start to show symptoms of PTSD. Now, it's not purely environmental, right? It's estimated that over half of the population will experience some traumatic event, truly traumatic event in their life, and yet less than 10% of the population will ever develop PTSD. But for those who do develop PTSD, we see symptoms like flashbacks, right? Repeated recall, vivid recall of these memories. They often experience nightmares, they may have social withdrawal, we may see outbursts of anger, problems with sleeping. These are all common symptoms we tend to see with post traumatic stress. Prevalence and onset is really interesting, right? Onset rates, as a reminder, is when do we tend to see people show symptoms of a particular disorder? Well, PTSD, there's no set onset because it depends on when the trauma is. We can have evidence of people experiencing PTSD as young as a couple years old or in their 80s and 90s. And so it really just depends on when did the trauma take place. As far as prevalence rates, the latest estimates are right around 8.5% of Americans or so will experience symptoms of PTSD at some point in their life. And we're looking at around 3 to 4% in any particular year. Other trends: women are more likely to experience PTSD than men, which is interesting because for a lot of people, when they think about PTSD, they tend to think of the combat soldier, right? And although we do tend to see a lot of PTSD with our combat veterans, there are lots of things that can cause PTSD. Growing up in poverty, being a victim of sexual abuse or physical abuse. And so when we look at and we bring in factors such as domestic violence and abuse, at the end of the day, women are more prone to experience PTSD than men. I have two more things on this slide here. The idea of the dose response model is this interesting look at the level of trauma you experience is often related to the severity of the PTSD, which makes sense. When we look at someone who perhaps loses their home to a fire, and we compare that to someone who has been in combat, and we compare that to someone who's experienced some severe physical or sexual abuse, as the abuse becomes more severe and traumatic, the likelihood and the severity of the PTSD will also increase, what we call the dose response model. And then finally, worth noting that for some, going through a traumatic event can actually lead to what we call survivor resiliency, or what some people call post traumatic growth. And this is the idea of the person who maybe has an experience where they almost die. Right, they live through this horrible natural disaster, let's say, and from that moment on, they kind of rededicate their life to some particular purpose. And we've heard those stories before, where they say, it wasn't until my life flashed before my very eyes that I realized I need to cherish this life that I've been given. And so since then, I have started my own charity, or I've built these schools, or I've done whatever it may be, right? I've started this program for veterans. To help them cope with living with PTSD. When we see people respond to trauma in a way that is positive, in a way that shows growth, then we call that survivor resiliency. All right, that just about does it for our unit on stress. As you work through this, if you came across anything you're not quite sure on, reach out to me and let me know. Otherwise, good luck, everyone.